Hello, welcome to the Thyroid Pharmacist Healing Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Izabella Wentz, the Thyroid Pharmacist, and I'm so excited to have you join me here for another episode. Today we're going to be talking about whether a parasitic infection could be the driver behind your Hashimoto's diagnosis, irritable bowel syndrome, and chronic hives. When I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's, I wanted to figure out what was my root cause and what was really the driving factor behind my symptoms. And I came across research from Dr. Alessio Fasano that talked about the three-legged stool of autoimmunity. So this theory proposed that for an autoimmune condition to develop, you had to have three things present. The first one was the genetic predisposition. The second one was some kind of a trigger. And then the third one was intestinal permeability or a leaky gut. He further proposed that if you can get rid of one of these things, that the autoimmune condition would go into remission. This has been known as the three-legged stool of autoimmunity theory, and the theory is that all three legs need to be present in order for the stool to stand. And so I was very intrigued by this because when I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's, I had been diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome about 10 years prior to that, and I had very clear digestive symptoms. So I had diarrhea and I had acid reflux, I had bloating, stomach aches and pains, and so the kind of like gut and thyroid connection really made sense to me. And what was really interesting is that, thinking about the three-legged stool of autoimmunity, you have your genes, which you can't necessarily change, right? Not in this day and age. You have some triggers. And I had heard that Epstein-Barr virus was a potential trigger, but once you get a virus, it kind of stays with you. So can you do anything about it? But then the third piece of that was that intestinal permeability. And if you could find what was driving that intestinal permeability and fix it and make your gut less permeable, you can get yourself into remission. And so a big part of my healing journey started with getting off of a variety of foods. Getting off of these foods definitely helped me feel better, but at a certain point I hit a plateau where the bloating started to come back and some of my digestive symptoms started to come back. Not the acid reflux, that was gone after going gluten and dairy free, but just some distension. I remember looking kind of pregnant towards the end of my workday. And I remember my stomach aches were starting to come back. And I'm like, do I need to just cut out more foods? And for a while I did that. But then, that really wasn't the answer. And I got too thin. My skin started to look just really dull. And I was like, okay, there's something more going on here. And I started doing a lot of stool testing. Functional medicine, it's the root of all disease is in the gut. And I had done a lot of different stool tests. Most of them found I had low lactobacillus bacteria. And so I started utilizing probiotics. But there was nothing ever exciting in the stool tests until I did one where a protozoa called Blastocystis hominis came out as positive. Now, this was really, really interesting to me. I was like, I wonder if this has anything to do with Hashimoto's. And I looked online and there was no information about this protozoa being connected with Hashimoto's. It was actually kind of a controversial protozoa where they said sometimes it's commensal, so it's just there and it's not causing any problems. And that sometimes it can actually cause irritable bowel syndrome and chronic urticaria or chronic hives. And I was like, oh, wait, I had chronic hives. I had irritable bowel syndrome. And then I further looked into it. I started doing as much research as I could on it. And then it said that it can also cause multiple food sensitivities. And I was like, wait a minute, I've got multiple food sensitivities. So I'm wondering if this is what's driving my intestinal permeability. When I first started looking at some of the forums, the patient forums, which I also used to help guide my thought process, I used functional medicine doctors, integrative doctors, PubMed research, as well as patient experiences. Nobody in the thyroid world was talking about it, but some other people, in the IBS world, were talking about this protozoa, and they were saying how it's notorious for being difficult to treat. So I was like, oh man, what am I going to do? But of course, being a pharmacist, I was like, okay, I'm very determined. Let's pull out the big guns. And so I asked my doctor for some heavy-duty anti-parasitic meds. I ended up taking the medication Alinea for 60 days straight. I would never recommend that. Like, you need to take it for 3 days, but I was like, just overkill. By the end of that time, I remember being like on my couch, depressed, and just feeling kind of like I was about to go crazy. And I feel like it really, really messed with my gut flora. And I had to do a lot of probiotics after, and I had to take high doses of thiamine after to restore my thiamine levels. It can definitely cause nutrient depletions. It could definitely cause deficiency in probiotic bacteria, but it did the job for blasto. I remember through the process, I would start getting joint aches and pains. And this really weird thing, after I finished the treatment, I used to have this knee pain, like almost like my knee would be swollen and filled with fluid. And I had this wonderful dog that I would walk around Chicago. And every day after I would walk him, I would just get this awful knee pain and my knee would be like swollen. The weird thing is, like, the knee pain flared up during the treatment, but then went away forever. And I found some evidence that some of these protozoa can actually live in our like knee fluid. So that's kind of random. I wonder if this was actually something that was happening. The other thing that happened is like my digestive function cleared up and a lot of my food sensitivities got better and my thyroid antibodies got better. But I should also mention, I didn't just do that medication. I also took anti-parasitic herbs for 60 days after that. So I took like wormwood, berberine, oil of oregano to try to get that eradicated. So I actually did like a 4-month protocol. And throughout that process, I felt like a lot of my symptoms really vanished and my thyroid antibodies significantly reduced. And so fast forward into the future, I'm working with clients with Hashimoto's, and I know that intestinal permeability is a factor. Some people can get intestinal permeability into remission through going gluten-free if they're celiac. Sometimes that helps. Some people, by treating H. pylori infections, can get into remission. Some people, nutrient deficiencies. And I'm seeing some of these various root causes. And I'm doing a lot of gut testing with my clients. But at some point, I realized that 1 in 3 of my clients are testing positive for blasto on the stool test I was doing with them. And I reached out to one of my mentors and I was like, hey, are you seeing these kind of results on the stool test that you're doing? Are you seeing this many people popping up with blasto? My mentor, Dan Kalish, at the time was seeing a variety of clients, right? Not necessarily people with Hashimoto's. And he's like, no, that's a really high rate of blasto that you're seeing. I wonder if it's related to Hashimoto's. And so interestingly, I was seeing 1 in 3 people with it, at least, on the testing that I did. It's present in about 20% of healthy controls and about 61% of those that have chronic hives or chronic urticaria. And then even more than that, it's present very frequently in people with irritable bowel syndrome. Now, if you're somebody that has Hashimoto's, multiple food sensitivities, chronic hives, even if you've had them just one time, and if you have had irritable bowel syndrome, even if it's better now, this might be something to consider because in the early stages, the protozoa, when it gets into your system, it's going to be causing chronic hives and it's going to be causing irritable bowel syndrome. And then once your body kind of works it in and it just starts to cause that low-grade inflammation is when you might actually start seeing those thyroid antibodies. And so interestingly, like 25% of people with chronic hives actually have Hashimoto's thyroid antibodies, and sometimes taking thyroid hormone can resolve the symptoms of chronic hives. And there's various studies showing that like 20 to 25% of people with irritable bowel syndrome might actually have subclinical hypothyroidism. Now, when I went to functional medicine training through the Institute of Functional Medicine, this is one of the things that they mentioned is that sometimes and many times people will get irritable bowel syndrome first, and then 5 to 10 years later, they'll have an autoimmune diagnosis. This was certainly my case. This has been the case for many of my clients, and perhaps this might be your root cause too. I remember I had one particular client who reached out to me with very early Hashimoto's antibodies and very severe IBS. That person, initially I thought SIBO was the driver behind IBS. That's what I had learned. And this person did not have SIBO, but they did have blasto. And treating that blasto helped them completely get rid of the IBS, as well as reduce their thyroid antibodies. And this is something that can be very much possible for people if they catch their thyroid antibodies early and before there's like a change in TSH, and you figure out what the driver is, what the root cause of your autoimmunity is, and you can treat it. Now, I do want to share that since I shared this information on the internet, I think it was 2014 or so where I shared this, after the fact, researchers started making the connection between blasto and Hashimoto's as well. So I'm going to share a couple of research articles. Let's see, we have a 2020 study measured T3, free T4, TSH, thyroid antiperoxidase antibodies, and interleukin 17, which mediates inflammation levels of 20 people with Hashimoto's and a Blastocystis hominis infection, and 20 people with neither condition. Interleukin 17 was significantly higher in those with Hashimoto's who were infected with blasto compared with Hashimoto's patients who were not infected. After Blastocystis hominis was eradicated, TSH, anti-TPO, and IL-17 were significantly decreased. Researchers concluded that the treatment of Blastocystis hominis infection improves Hashimoto's through reductions of interleukin 17, thyroid peroxidase antibodies, and TSH levels. Now, I don't generally test interleukin 17 levels in my clients, but I do find that they, in many cases, can have improvements in the thyroid peroxidase antibodies with treatment, and they can also have improvements in TSH levels. I don't see this when somebody is like an advanced case very often, but generally speaking in the early cases that I do. We do know that thyroid antibodies can be present for 5 to 10 years before there's a change in TSH that's seen. And so if those antibodies have been present for a while, there's going to be a damage to the thyroid gland. Ideally, we want to find the thyroid antibodies early, and that's why I really advocate for everybody with irritable bowel syndrome to test their thyroid function, because you can actually prevent thyroid disease. You can prevent all kinds of autoimmunity if you do that. There's now also a published case report of a gentleman who was 49 years old, and he had chronic hives. Now, his practitioners tested him for Hashimoto's. He was found to have it, although he never had any clear symptoms. And so it was like as part of the investigation for the chronic hives, they found it. And they also found Blastocystis hominis on a stool exam, and he was given a 2-week treatment with metronidazole, which is one of the common antiparasitic medications. So after that point, the Blastocystis hominis was eradicated, so they got rid of it, and the chronic hives disappeared. But what's more interesting is during the 4 years of follow-up for this patient, he presented without any symptoms, and then his thyroid hormones were normalized, and his thyroid antibodies had declined. So again, this is a person with like early stage Hashimoto's that likely didn't have as much thyroid gland damage. Now, it's kind of controversial. Most of the studies with Blastocystis hominis have been done with irritable bowel syndrome, and something like up to 73% of people can have it on their stool test if, they do the right kind of stool test. Not all stool tests are created equally. There was a range between 13 to 73% of people. Like some tests would only find 13% of people with IBS had it. Other tests would say 73%. And no stool test is 100% reliable. And there's also this school of thought that believes that there are different variants and only some of them might be infectious, and some of the variants are going to be commensal, which essentially means like they don't cause any problems. For me, it's a matter of like better out than in. We do know that Blastocystis hominis can break down secretory IgA, which is the gut's first line of defense. And that really impacts the immune system of its infected host, which then can lead through, inducing intestinal permeability, which can predispose us to autoimmunity. Now, I want to talk through some of the places where, if you have this trifecta, IBS, Hashimoto's, and hives, right, you probably are thinking about, should you get tested? You can absolutely get tested for this. You can do a test with most conventional doctors called ova and parasites ×3, but I do have to warn you, this might come out negative. Generally speaking, though, it might be covered on insurance, so it's worth a try. Sometimes it does come out positive, and you might find something. There's also a test known as the GI map that I oftentimes will use. This goes through a lot of different metrics. It might look at secretory IgA, which tells us our gut immune defense. It could look at our elastase levels, which let us know about our pancreatic enzyme function to see if we might benefit from those. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes to Rupa Health, Direct Labs, and My Med Lab, where you can self-order that, or you can order it through your functional practitioner. And this test is a great place to start, although unfortunately I will say that I'm oftentimes still seeing false negatives. And I will oftentimes do another test like the gut zoomer test, as well as a test called Para-Wellness Research. Sometimes these tests are more likely to find a blasto infection. As far as treatment options, now you can be following the best diet in the entire world. If you have blasto, you're going to have blasto, and it's going to make you sensitive to a lot of foods. And that's why I'm a big proponent of people talk about the autoimmune paleo diet, and I think it's a great elimination diet. It can be very helpful if you use it for 30, 60, maybe max 90 days. But the goal is not to use it alone. Like, the elimination diet helps you reduce inflammation because you are off of the foods that are triggering inflammation. But it's not because they're bad foods in most cases, right? If you're eating a well-balanced, mostly organic diet, unless you're eating like processed junk, you should be able to tolerate like healthy foods like nuts and seeds and eggs, right? If you're reacting to a ton of different foods, there's a good chance that you have some kind of a gut infection. Now, blasto, up to 35% of people with Hashimoto's, in my opinion, have it. I can confirm that through some of the lab tests I've done with people, and that can absolutely be the cause behind your food sensitivities too, in addition to the Hashimoto's antibodies. And so I find that some people will stay on this diet forever to kind of like manage symptoms. The Blastocystis Research Foundation said that some patients can manage symptoms with an extensive exclusion diet, which may include the exclusion of refined sugar, wheat, dairy, products like rice, corn, carbonated drinks, tea, coffee, alcohol, and fruit, which sounds like a lot of the autoimmune paleo diet, right? But you can get a lot of these foods back if you support your digestion properly. So let's talk about some treatment options. Medications are an option. I definitely would not take the medication Alinea for 2 months. Generally speaking, you can take it maybe for 3 days and then 2 weeks off, and then repeat again for 3 days and then 2 weeks off and then 3 more days. This ensures that you address more than one life cycle of the parasite. Typically, parasites tend to have like 28 to 30-day life cycles. And so during the various phases of their life cycles, they might be like hidden away so that the medications or herbs you're using aren't affecting them. So this is one option that people might utilize. Metronidazole is a common medication, but it does seem to have a lot of cases of resistance with this particular protozoa. And then people can also have a lot of side effects from metronidazole. So I don't love it. I will say both with Alinea and metronidazole, you do want to look into thiamine deficiencies that can come as a result, potentially alpha lipoic acid deficiencies. Sometimes, people take medications to treat something and they end up with side effects from the medications. And the SpectraCell test is probably my favorite test to figure out what kind of deficiencies you might have, just as a side note there. Other types of medications that can be utilized include the loxanide furoate, Bactrim, and secnidazole. These are some options. There are natural treatment options. I have used the herb wormwood. This is something that I don't necessarily recommend unless you are getting your liver function tested with a practitioner, because it can be toxic to the liver when you use it for too long. There's also berberine and oil of oregano. Using that over the course of 60 days can be helpful for this. Again, we want to cover those 2 life cycles. And then another kind of surprising thing, and this is actually my go-to treatment, is going to be Saccharomyces boulardii. So this is a beneficial yeast, and I first learned about it seeing a very small study in children with blasto. They were given 250 milligrams of Saccharomyces boulardii twice a day for 10 days, and then tested periodically until they received a clinical cure rate of 94.4% after 30 days. So 94% of these children were able to eradicate blasto with just utilizing Saccharomyces boulardii, which is like a beneficial probiotic yeast. And this is so gentle compared to the medications, compared to the wormwood, compared to the, I love me some berberine, and oil of oregano is great too, but it's much more gentle than those. And I've seen actually people fail various anti-parasitic, like herbal protocols that were very, very fancy from other practitioners without using that Saccharomyces boulardii. So Saccharomyces boulardii, what it does is it raises our secretory IgA levels, so that immune response. So that just gives our body an opportunity to fight the infection on its own. And it has been remarkably helpful for these kind of infections where at this point I'm like, okay, these children did it for 10 days, so twice a day. So let's double the dose for adults, maybe 500 milligrams twice a day for 30 to 60 days. And a lot of times people will find that this can go away with a very gentle treatment. Now, I will say sometimes they need to combine it with other things, but definitely if Saccharomyces boulardii is tolerated, then I would definitely include it as part of the protocol for a person if they had blasto. Some other herbs that might be helpful include garlic oil, black cumin seed. It's like a cure for everything but death, right? And then some people actually advocate for using like enzymes, like lipase-containing digestive enzymes, because when blasto goes through its life cycles, it can get into this cyst stage where it has a fat-containing wall that prevents various treatments from reaching it. So in some cases, using digestive enzymes like pancreatic enzymes, some of the veggie digestive enzymes might have lipase, is thought to potentially break down that cyst wall. And then, of course, if you are having a lot of food sensitivities from this bugger, then removing those food sensitivities for a time being while your gut heals will help to kind of tame that inflammation so that you'll feel a lot better. So this is something that, I'm really, really passionate about, is figuring out what some of the root causes are in Hashimoto's and what's driving us to have this autoimmune dysfunction. Does everybody with Hashimoto's have blasto? I don't think so. Does everybody with Hashimoto's, if you treat blasto, is that a complete cure? I don't think so either, but in some people, it could be absolutely the only root cause that they have. In other people, it might be an exacerbating factor. What I do know is that most people, if they find it and they treat it, they feel better afterwards. So symptom-wise, thyroid antibody-wise, and in some cases, in the early stages, we can see, prevention of thyroid disease and maybe normalization of TSH. Now, I'm very, very passionate about these root causes, and I'm very passionate about the treatment solutions. I've done so much research on Hashimoto's over the last decade plus. My first book, Hashimoto's The Root Cause, talks about the various different root causes. My second book, Hashimoto's Protocol, goes through like a stepwise approach on what to do over the 90 days if you've been diagnosed with Hashimoto's. So for example, blasto is one potential trigger, but there could be other triggers. For example, H. pylori is another trigger, gut-related trigger. And so you might find utilizing beneficial yeast can help you with overcoming both infections. And that's how I've arranged the Hashimoto's Protocol, where you go through a step-by-step approach based on some of the patterns I've seen in people with Hashimoto's. Now, I will say one thing I really want to mention is people who maybe have read some of my social media posts or my blog think that everybody has 80 causes and that everybody has to take 80 supplements. And that's not my goal for you guys, and that's not correct at all. My goal is to educate about all of the different causes and all of the different solutions. And so, and as well as symptoms, how to overcome some of the symptoms. Not everybody with Hashimoto's has weight gain. Some people have excess weight loss that they don't want. Not everybody with Hashimoto's has hair loss. Not everybody has fatigue, but some people do. And just as you might not have every single Hashimoto's symptom, you probably don't have every Hashimoto's trigger. And you probably don't need every supplement and diet that I recommend. But my goal is to educate you about understanding your own body so that you understand the signs and symptoms your body is giving you, right? And so you can be okay, I have hives, I have IBS, I have elevated thyroid antibodies and a ton of food sensitivities. You know what? I think I need to get tested for gut infections. And then you can be okay, now I know what to do. I don't need 75 different herbs, medications, supplements, but this might be a great place to start. So I hope I can address that. I've seen that lately on a lot of my social media commentary that you recommend so many things. And I'm yeah, not for everybody to take all at once. These are just some potential options, and these are some potential root causes to consider. And so hopefully through this podcast, I'll be able to educate you guys a bit more about how to understand your body and the signals that your body is sending you and what some of the signs and symptoms may indicate, and then lead you to solutions for whatever symptoms, whatever root causes you might have. If you found this podcast enjoyable, please share it with others. I'm going to give you guys a whole bunch of links in the show notes that talk about blasto. This is a little bit of a baby deep dive into it. I also have an article about that from my website that I'm going to link below. And definitely tune in for the upcoming episodes. Thank you so much for joining. I hope this has been a healing conversation on your journey. Until next time.